There is a particular kind of waiting that most people never admit to. It is not passive exactly. You are still moving, still working, still making plans. But underneath the activity is a quiet expectation that something will arrive, a better opportunity, a period of life when conditions are finally right. A person who will see what you are capable of and give you the platform to prove it. A version of tomorrow that is easier than today. The Stoics had no patience for this. Not because they were harsh, but because they understood what this waiting actually is, a sophisticated form of self-abandonment dressed as hope. While you are waiting to be saved by circumstances, by luck, by other people's recognition, the one thing that could actually change your life is going unused. It sits there every morning, available, requiring nothing except the decision to use it. The Stoics called it self-discipline, and they treated it not as a virtue for the exceptional, but as the basic obligation of anyone who wants to live a life they chose rather than a life that happened to them. No one is coming. The Stoics said this not to be cruel, but to be genuinely liberating. Because the moment you stop waiting, you can begin. Welcome to Logostoic. In today's video, we're going to examine the Stoic understanding of self-discipline, not as a productivity hack or a morning routine, but as the most fundamental act of self-respect available to a human being. If you don't want to miss content like this, consider subscribing to Logostoic and turning on notifications. Now let's begin. Cleanthes of Assos arrived in Athens with almost nothing. He had come to study philosophy under Zeno, the founder of Stoicism, but had no money to pay for his education and no patron willing to support him. So he worked. During the day he carried water for market gardens, hard physical labor, the kind reserved for slaves and the destitute, and at night he sat in lecture halls taking notes on wax tablets he could not afford to replace. He scraped the wax smooth when it was full and wrote again. The people of Athens noticed this strange student and summoned him before a court to account for himself, because a man who worked as hard as he did during the day should not have had the time to study philosophy at night. They wanted to know how he sustained himself. Cleanthes called his employers as witnesses, and the court, apparently satisfied, offered him a financial gift. He refused it. He continued carrying water. He continued studying. And when Zeno died, it was Cleanthes, the water carrier, the man who scraped his notes off wax tablets, who became the head of the Stoic school. The story of Cleanthes is not a story about talent. It is a story about self-discipline exercised in conditions that most people would use as a reasonable excuse to stop. He did not wait for better circumstances. He did not wait until he could afford to study properly, or until someone recognized his potential and sponsored it. He worked within the constraints of his actual life, not the life he wished he had. And the discipline he exercised in those years, the discipline of showing up, of refusing the comfortable reason to quit, of treating the work as non-negotiable regardless of the conditions, was precisely the preparation that made him capable of leading when the moment came. This is the Stoic position on self-discipline. It is not about performing virtue in favorable conditions. It is about maintaining the standard in unfavorable ones. Seneca wrote that the person who postpones their life is like the drunk who promises to reform tomorrow. Always tomorrow, never now. The problem is not a lack of intention. It is a lack of the practice that converts intention into behavior. And that practice, the Stoics believed, is developed not through inspiration but through repetition, through the accumulated weight of small choices made correctly when the easier choice was available. Every time you choose the harder option when nothing is forcing you to, you are not just completing a task. You are building the architecture of a self that can be relied upon. And that architecture, once built, holds in conditions that inspiration never survives. Marcus Aurelius understood this from a position that makes the observation impossible to romanticize. He was not a young man choosing hardship voluntarily. He was an emperor who suffered from chronic illness, who governed through plagues and wars he did not choose, who had access to every form of comfort that the ancient world could produce, and who still had to argue himself out of bed every morning. He recorded this honestly. He wrote about the pull of the warm blanket, the voice that said rest was deserved, the temptation to begin properly tomorrow, and he wrote the response he gave himself, that you were not born for this, that the trees and the ants and the bees do not deliberate about whether to do their nature, that the work of being human is not optional. What is striking about these passages in the Meditations is not that Marcus won every argument with himself. He probably did not. What is striking is that he kept having the argument. He kept showing up to the question of his own discipline, even when he was tired, even when he was sick, even when the empire was in crisis and rest would have been understandable. Self-discipline, as Marcus practiced it, was not a state you arrived at. It was a conversation you refused to stop having with yourself. The failure was not in losing the occasional morning. The failure would have been in giving up the conversation entirely. Epictetus made this point from a different direction. He taught that freedom, genuine freedom, not the legal kind but the inner kind, belongs only to the person who has learned to govern themselves. The person who is governed by appetite, by comfort, by the need for approval, by the fear of difficulty, is not free regardless of what their legal status says. They are owned by their own impulses. Self-discipline, in this framing, is not the absence of pleasure or the embrace of hardship for its own sake. It is the capacity to choose, in any given moment, what you actually want over what you happen to feel like. That capacity, exercised consistently, is the only genuine form of autonomy the Stoics recognized. None of this requires exceptional circumstances or exceptional character to begin. It requires only what Cleanthes had in Athens with nothing: the decision to treat the work as non-negotiable, and to begin from wherever you actually are rather than waiting for conditions that feel more worthy of your effort. The conditions will never be perfect. The moment will never announce itself as the right one. The Stoics were direct about this. The person who waits for ideal conditions has already chosen, functionally, not to act. The only moment available is this one. Self-discipline, as the Stoics understood it, is not punishment. It is not the suppression of the self in service of some external standard. It is the most precise expression of what you actually value, because what you do in the moments when nothing is forcing you reveals, more accurately than anything you say, what you have decided your life is for. No one is coming to save you. Not from your circumstances, not from your habits, not from the version of yourself that finds reasons to postpone, but the capacity to save yourself, to choose, this morning and the next and the one after that, to be the person your best judgment approves of, that has always been available. It did not require better conditions. It required only the decision to stop waiting for them. The capacity to save yourself has always been available. It did not require better conditions. It required only the decision to stop waiting for them. That is what today's video was about. And if something in it landed with more weight than you expected, that weight is probably pointing at something worth paying attention to. If this video gave you something real, consider liking it, not as a reflex, but because ideas that ask something of you, rather than just making you feel good, deserve to reach the people who are ready to be asked. Every like carries this conversation to someone who might need it more than you realize. And leave a comment. Write down the one thing you have been postponing, not for lack of time, but for lack of the decision to begin. Name it plainly, because the Stoics understood that the act of naming is itself a form of commitment, and commitment is where self-discipline actually starts. The version of yourself you are waiting to become is not in the future. They are in the next decision. Subscribe to Logostoic and turn on notifications, because this kind of thinking is not something you settle in a single conversation. Cleanthes spent years scraping wax off tablets and writing again. We will keep showing up if you will. May you begin, and having begun, continue, not because the conditions are right, but because you have decided that you are.